While the Russian counteroffensive in Kursk seems to have already faltered, it has stopped gaining grounds for several days now. The Russians are about to achieve an operational victory in the southeast with the capture of the mining and fortress town of Vuhledar. We'll talk about this as well as about what else has changed along the front line, about troop generation, and so much more as usually in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. Before we switch to the front line, we quickly mention the air attacks. The Ukrainian President Zelensky said on the 21st of September that the week before, the Russians had used 900 glide bombs, 400 Shahid, and around 30 missiles and cruise missiles against Ukraine within just 1 week. 900 glide bombs, 400 Shahid drones, plus the 30 cruise missiles and missiles. We switch to the Kursk region, and here we have a almost negligible advance, to be perfectly honest. We have a geolocation right east of Veseloe, where the Ukrainians have advanced 2 tree lines. This is at this point here. So the Ukrainians are a little bit further to the east now, roughly at this point. But that's already it. What I have in changes in total of the Kursk region. So while technically the Ukrainians have advanced, they didn't really significantly, but the bigger picture here is that the Russian counteroffensive that managed to unblock the cauldron here in Glushkovo, the Glushkovo pocket, while it has managed to achieve that, the capture of Snagost plus some small towns around it, it seems to already have stopped. We switch over to the Kharkiv region, and there we have not much to report except that the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, has published a video showing the capture of the aggregate plant in the northern part of Volchansk, the area where they're still fighting north of the river here. This was a pocket where Russians were mostly cut off from contact with the rest. And here now we have video evidence of the Ukrainians recapturing that position here. We switch over to the Eastern Front because that was already it in Kharkiv. And here on the Eastern Front, we have the Russians in the northwest of Makivka. This is down here, where the Russians have crossed the Sherebets, and we have the geolocation. As you can see, it's in the northwest now. Recently, we had it here and somewhere here in the south. So as of now, I cannot fully confirm it, but once again, it seems like Makivka was taken. Last time I thought it was probably taken. We had Russian mill bloggers later saying, no, in the north, the Ukrainians still are. It seems that now at least it's closer to being captured. Maybe it's captured now, not completely sure. But the bigger part is the Russians have managed to cross the Sherebets here at Makivka. Further south, right at a few kilometers further south at Nevelske, we also have the Russians advancing, and here we have them a little bit further to the north. Not a major advance here as well, but basically they have reached somewhere here. They recently had a smaller break into the Ukrainian defensive lines, reaching Nevelske. Now they have extended it somewhat to the north here, but overall the situation here hasn't changed significantly. We'll switch over to the southern area, here south of the Seversky Donetsk here, the river here, and there I have nothing to report. I do not see any changes in Chasiv Yar, and while fighting in Toretsk has continued, and the Russians have probably captured some ground here, I do not see any significant change. Now there's, for instance, a fresh geolocation of a Ukrainian armored fighting vehicle being blown up here, but from the looks of it, it seems to roll westwards, and at least the Russians claim it was from the withdrawal of the Ukrainians. So I cannot really say. We could, if we want to interpret it, that Ukrainian counterattacks were successful, reaching to this point here. But at the same time, it's quite possible that it's a week old and it actually showed Ukrainians withdrawing along that line and losing one APC or IFV at this point here. But overall, I do not see any significant change that I can prove to a high degree of certainty. So while it hasn't changed much here, we switch to the Pokrovsk area. Here we have the Russians advance in this area here, where they have advanced westwards to Rodivka. I showed you in the last situation report that the Russians probably have taken the southernmost of the 3 towns. Now we have the Russians pushing forward here at the reservoir. Again, barely barely a need to mention it. I mean, it shows that they have entered the town of Mykolaiv, but that's more or less it. I do not see any significant change in the direction of Pokrovsk itself. That doesn't mean that the front line hasn't moved. We have another geolocation here where the Russians are now directly south of Selidove. They have taken Ukrainsk. The Ukrainians admit that by now, and they have reached the railroad line here, and they have widened their presence here closer towards Selidove, showing that now they are increasing the pressure towards the town itself after the most likely capture of Makivka, and they've also widened their control over the area here. Roughly all of this is now in Russian control since the last update that we had here on this channel. Further to the south, we have the Russians starting to push in the pocket here at Shelane Pershe. After the most likely capture of Shelane Pershe, there were still Ukrainians in the east here, and it seems they have started to withdraw. Now the Ukrainians admit that roughly this area here has fallen into Russian hands, clearly showing that the withdrawal towards the west has started in this area here as well. Further south, I have no change in the direction of Kurakhove. Nothing here has changed, but as you might see, if you remember how the map looked the last time, at Vuhledar it has changed quite drastically. We have the Russians now confirmed to fully control the mine number 3, which is right here west of Vuhledar, and which was obviously a massive structure helping to secure the northern flank of Vuhledar. Vuhledar has several high rises that offer good protection and is on a fairly high ground, so it allowed the Ukrainians to defend the southeastern flank of their overall front line here, and now the Russians are in the process of flanking it completely, and it seems that they will force either capture the town directly through brute force fairly soon or force a Ukrainian withdrawal. We have geolocation here of them to the right in the eastern part. The Russians have already apparently taken the dachas right at the east of Vuhledar and now have entered the high rises here. Fighting has already started inside of the town. They managed to push forward towards the whole region here, but that's not all. They also managed to cross the river in the south. They managed to gain a foothold here in the industrial buildings right north of the Kalahar. I don't know how the river is exactly pronounced. I apologize. Kashlahar. That's it. Kashlahar. Here they have crossed over it, but in the west of it, this whole area here has now fallen to the Russians as well. In total, that's 9 kilometers in width and 2.5 kilometers in depth. And as you can see, they're pushing north right here to the west of Vuhledar, and they're pushing towards the northeast here. So the overall situation in Vuhledar is getting more difficult by the day as of now. Then we only have one more news on the ground, basically. I have nothing on the west, but I have something here from the Crimean Peninsula. The Russians have started to build their flag towers here on the island. We have pictures now that they have the metal constructions that we know from Russia itself, where they have started building them, for instance, around Moscow. Those are being built here now as well, with a Panzer Shorad short-range air defense system right on it to protect the bridge that is being threatened here. Whether the bridge has the same significance, though, fairly soon is a different question, and there we come to the overall assessment. Now, while in the north not much has changed, even in the east here, obviously the Ukrainians are being threatened. Should the Russians reach the Oskil, then they would cut the bridgehead over the Oskil in half with a northern and a southern part. Chasiv Yar is mostly stable. Here the Russians have pushed at Toretsk and at New York, but the big change is obviously the southeast here, Vuhledar. Right now, the situation seems to show that Vuhledar is about to fall. Obviously, the city itself, the town itself, is fairly good, fairly easy to defend. The soldiers there are experienced and could give a good fight. but the flanks have collapsed. The flanks are in the, or at the very least, they are in the process of collapsing. And a look at the map already shows that the obstacles to flank, to continue advancing at both flanks of Vuhledar are very limited. We're talking about a few windbreaker tree lines, and that's mostly it. All the other towns that would offer more resistance are so far in the back that once they are reached, Vuhledar is completely cut off. So while the Ukrainians would likely have a serious chance of keeping up the defense of Vuhledar, probably for weeks even, depending on how well they are reinforced and resupplied, maybe even longer. The bigger question is, can they keep open the lines of communications towards Vuhledar? And that seems doubtful, as the majority of the fortifications have already been overcome. The geography doesn't offer much obstacles, and at the same time, the Russians, for instance, from this direction here, are even able to even flank potential Ukrainian fortifications coming from the east here. This makes it likely, to my assessment, that Vuhledar will be given up in the near future. I do not think the Ukrainians have much of a choice, unless, of course, their assessment is that they are suddenly able to hold the Russians for a longer time. And that would probably be worth it if they were capable of doing it. And if they are capable of supplying Vuhledar, that's the next question, because they are here so close now that to Vuhledar, to the flanks, that even resupply will be able to be struck with artillery, with mortars, and with FPV drones. But Vuhledar has a major importance, as it's the anchor, basically, the southeastern anchor of the front line that stops the Russians, that holds the flanks, and most importantly, that threatens the railroad line here. Now, the Russians have built another railroad line in the south that we can see here. This already allows them to connect the railroad system in the south, in the so-called land bridge towards the Crimea, with the rest of the Russian-controlled territory. But there was an already existing railroad line in the north that was initially, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion by the Russians, was fully in Ukrainian mortar range and was stopped in usage. As you can see, the eastern part of it was Russian-controlled since 2014-15, whereas the western part was Ukrainian-controlled. So far, the Russians haven't really been able to use that railroad line, as the Ukrainians would have been able to shell it at will. Now the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back outside of mortar range. Now only solid 155 millimeter artillery can still shell it. If Vuhledar has fallen and the Ukrainians are being pushed back roughly at that line, or maybe even at a Kurakhove line, that line can be fully re-established, securing the whole supply situation in the south here, and thus obviously making the reliance upon the Kerch Bridge less important as it is of now. So while Vuhledar itself is just a small town with probably a couple of thousand inhabitants in the overall picture, it's a small victory, a small one, like so many other small towns that have fallen to the Russians. With its position and with the fact that it held the Russians at bay for 2 years at this point, the loss of it can probably be considered an operational victory, as it will have major implications for the Ukrainian situation in the south, with the Russians improving and securing their supply lines through the railroad network and through the connection of the second line here. Also, obviously, offering some resilience in case the bridges are being attacked. There are at least 2 bridges on the new line here that could theoretically be struck and maybe destroyed. Having a second line obviously increases the resilience of the Russians to fight against this. So this is a bad situation here. I do not see any plus point for the Ukrainians here. This is a bigger defeat. There's no reason to call it strategic. This will probably not decide the war, but it is much bigger than a lot of other defeats that we've seen recently, as this will weaken the whole southeastern front, and with it the whole southern front, as the Russian resupply situation will improve significantly and be much more robust. At the same time, the Wall Street Journal is writing that the Russians seem to start to understand that their nuclear threats are no longer working. This is being discussed here on the channel and on so many channels in the past, that the continued threats with nuclear weapons by the Russians has lost its edge, most likely, and that the Western nations and the Western public is increasingly getting tired of it, and thus it's reducing the effectiveness of these threats. And the Wall Street Journal is also writing that the Russians are starting to understand that the global south, whom they have managed to keep fairly good relationships with, is getting increasingly annoyed by Russia keeping up the nuclear threats. Then we'll talk about troop generation, and here we have the first pictures of Russians with Chinese armored vehicles. Those have been identified, and according to claims, they have not been delivered by China. China has exported them to a couple of nations, which then could have handed it over to the Russians. But there again, we need to understand the implications of this and the importance for this, because if China sees their armored vehicles appearing in Russia, it would be the point where China would start to investigate where are they coming from and then threatening the suppliers to stop it. But this is only if China sees a reason to do that. And for China to see a reason to do that, the Western pressure would have to be big enough. At the same time, there are claims that the Chinese have developed an improved Shahid drone that is currently being tested inside of Russia, 2,000 kilometers of range, 50 kilograms warhead. The Chinese aren't just supplying 70% of the foreign sourced parts for Russian weapons. They have already started to develop attack drones for the Russians and delivering the parts for assembly towards Russia. Increasingly, China is selling more and more lethal weaponry towards for the Russians, even if those have not been directly delivered. If the West does not react sharply here, China will likely increase its deliveries and at some point in the near future include armored vehicles. If there's no repercussions, why shouldn't they? The Russians are willing to pay for it, even though that hurts the Russian economy. They still are able and willing to pay for it. And if the West doesn't stop China, then we can expect not just armored vehicles, but probably more in the near future. That's at least what I see in this. Then we have news about troop generation in other regards. A corruption case against a local politician of a rayon, which is like a sub-district from my rough understanding, was stopped because he volunteered for Ukraine. So this is what we talked about in the past, that the law was now accepted that criminals can stop the legal proceedings if they sign a contract to avoid being prosecuted and to avoid being sentenced. Then we also have the news that Bashkortostan, an oblast inside of Russia, is now offering 505,000 rubles, that's over $5,000, to prisoners that sign a contract. This already shows that the potential for prison recruits has expired. Now the Russians even need to force success here by paying them as well. In the past, everything that was needed was to offer them a pardon in case they sign up. Now this is no longer enough. Now they have to pay them 500,000 rubles as well. Another sign that the sources for Russian recruits are slowly drying up. We talked about it in the past, and as most of you know, I made a video about the Russian recruitment issues that will cause an increasing dilemma in the near future. Then we have a rather funny event. We have the Russians trying to avoid a reconnaissance drone of theirs, a Sala reconnaissance drones being shot down. You see, it's not just painted black to probably make it less visible. They also painted Ukrainian roundels on it, probably to confuse a potential FPV interceptor pilot. So he might think, oh, that's actually one of ours. And that was not enough. But they also painted the Balkenkreuz, it was called. That's the sign that was used by the Luftwaffe in World War II, by the German Luftwaffe. This cross here, they also painted this on top to stop the Ukrainians from striking their drones. But that's not all. We also have the report now here, the Defense Express is reporting in the past. I mentioned that the Russians have issues defending against FPV attacks on their reconnaissance drones. First of all, the reconnaissance drones are essential for the Russian kill chain. If they lose those in big numbers, which they are right now, that causes massive problems to the Russians. And those drones are not meant to avoid being struck by something. They only have one camera looking down, doing the reconnaissance work. Now the reports are appearing that the Russians have started to put additional cameras on it that would probably allow the pilot to fly evasive maneuvers to avoid Ukrainian strikes with FPV drones. So the air war between drones is heating up. I guess it's just a matter of time until we see kinetic weapons on drones from either side. basically a smaller kind of air war. At least that would be the logical continuation of the current developments. And finally, we have a Ukrainian presentation of Skynex. This is the Rheinmetall defense, air defense system that Rheinmetall has developed. They have given Ukraine the prototypes. The system isn't just, as we can see here, it's truck mounted and can be set down. It is also possible to mount it on APCs. For instance, on the Boxer, it's going to be installed either with 30 or 35 millimeter autocannons, fairly high range for a barrel anti-aircraft, high maneuverability, as you can see, with the quick rotation, and the fire rate is high, and with most modern optics, it's basically the natural successor of the German Gepard, and now the German Bundeswehr has ordered some of them as well. But that was already it from me for now for this situation report. If you like this situation report, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Leave a comment what you think about the current situation. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.